Hi students, today we're going to have a look at the lecture for week 12. So this will be focused on burnout in sport, so stress, burnout, and also the psychological effects of injuries in sport. So let's begin. I just need to share my screen with you. And pull up the lecture. Okay, so for the first section, we're going to have a look at stress in sport. In particular, explore the definitions, what stress is, as well as what coping is. So stress is a process by which individuals perceive and respond to particular events which they appraise as challenging or threatening. So each person, when you are exposed to stress, will either think you can cope with it or you can't cope with it. Now, if you feel that you can't cope with it, you will start to experience the stress response, which is seeing the situation as threatening rather than challenging. Cognitive appraisal is a process through which the person evaluates whether a particular encounter with the environment is relevant to his or her well-being, and if so, in what ways. Okay, so we will always experience stress in our lives, and the way we appraise it will determine how we respond to it. And just as I explained before, if you feel it is just a challenge, then you'll have a go at it and would it be safe. But if you see the stress as a threatening situation, then you will experience the stress response. Types of sources of stress, there's a list here. So whether it's excessive pressure, your training environment, critical comments or feedback that are given. Spectators and selectors can also cause stress. Selection issues, overemphasis on winning, the opponents can cause stress, teammates and coach can cause stress, particularly relationships within the team. Physical and mental errors, a lot of people struggle to bounce back after they have made an error. Self-doubts, injury can become stressful. Personal goals and expectations, particularly when you set them too high. When you observe somebody else in your position doing well, can cause stress. Or the lack of role clarity or role structure within your environment. So we need to understand what coping is then. So if you do experience stress, you need to have, if you want to get through the stress in a facilitated way, you need to have coping strategies. So coping refers to the constantly changing cognitive and behavioural efforts to manage specific external or internal demands that are appraised as taxing or exceeding your resources as a person. So there are all different types of coping strategies, so I'll talk you through them. But if we can enhance athletes' coping abilities, then this should lead to an increase in performance and positive experiences in sport. So if athletes are confronted with stressful situations in competition and they feel equipped with coping strategies, then their experience in competition will be a lot more positive than one who can't cope. Let's have a look at adaptive versus maladaptive coping strategies. So adaptive strategies, you're looking at athletes who plan, who reframe positively a situation, who have support, who accept. These are called and have active coping strategies. So they will attempt to solve the problem as opposed to maladaptive. And often we'll find ourselves caught in this circumstance where we are seeing ourselves venting, we're in denial, we're distracting ourselves, or we disengage, we withdraw and not want to be involved. Okay, so that's the understanding of what stress is and what coping strategy is. So now let's have a look at staleness and burnout in sport, and then we'll finish with psychological effects of injuries in sport. So in terms of overtraining, it's actually a general training principle, but overtraining is when an athlete trains beyond the level that is ideal for maximum benefit, if we're looking at the psychological terms. And there is this training paradox. So overtraining, which we do have three outcomes, and I'll talk about that on the next slide, can happen. But the paradox is when the many benefits associated with exercise are actually reversed because of overtraining, and that can lead to staleness and burnout. So when you're experiencing an episode of training that's gone beyond your means, what you usually get, the benefits from that are reversed, and you actually get consequences from overtraining and doing too much. So this can lead to staleness and burnout. So here's the process. We overload, we overtrain, we overreach. 3 consequences of that. You can get positive overtraining benefits, so you get improved performance. You can get just maintenance, so no change in performance, or you could get negative overtraining burnout, and this impairs performance. So depending on what happens to the individual, whether they're coping through the situation, you experience one of 3 outcomes. So staleness is when an athlete experiences a plateau in performance that is difficult to overcome. Basically, this plateau is the body's initial failure to adapt to the training, and the athlete begins to overtrain to break through the plateau. And this can lead to burnout, which is quite ironic. So I'm experiencing no performance improvements, so I increase my training load because I want to see improvements. But what I'm actually doing is exhausting my body and my mind rather than improving performance. And that's a kind of another paradox. I'm not seeing benefits. I've got to increase performance. I've got to then increase my training load and get into this cycle of overtraining, and unfortunately can lead to physical or emotional or psychological exhaustion. So what happens when training, what happens when too much exercise becomes an obsession, which can happen to athletes, particularly when you're not seeing improvements. You just think, well, I've got to train harder. The negative things that can result from overtraining, a reduction in the effectiveness of the immune system. So you are more likely to not be able to flick a flu or fight through a flu or disease or injury because your body is too weak to do that. And the other thing is there is this increased negative psychological mood, and whether it is symptoms of depression, but you will have a negative experience in terms of mood. One of the main definitions that many psychs use to explain burnout in sport, it's a physical, emotional and social withdrawal from a formerly enjoyable sport activity. That's a sad thing about what burnout is you once did enjoy it. This withdrawal is characterized by emotional and physical exhaustion, reduced sense of accomplishment and sport devaluation. Moreover, burnout occurs as a result of chronic stress and motivational orientations and changes in the athlete. And it's really sad because this used to be the one sport that you used to love, particularly as a child when you started, and you get to a stage where you were actually exhausted from it, emotionally, physically, socially, and psychologically. We can experience burnout from both training and non-training factors. So your interactions with your coach, so if they're negative and your season's dragged down, and it can become taxing, but also people can experience burnout because of the restrictions that your sport plays on other life activities. You can't attend family functions or weddings or whatever because you have sport commitments. And it is a unique experience. It's a very personal experience. So how one person will experience burnout will be very different to another person. Athlete burnout, the dimensions, definitions, and symptoms. So let's have a look at the emotional and physical exhaustion. What that means is emotional and physical fatigue stemming from psychological and physical demands associated with training and comp. And what the symptoms you will see in the athletes is they're usually tired, really tired and lethargic. They're drained and they're unable to perform non-sport activities due to fatigue. So then they are withdrawing from other aspects of their life. The other dimension that gets affected is reduced sense of accomplishment. So there's this inefficiency and tendency to evaluate oneself negatively in terms of sport performance and accomplishments because they're not seeing any improvements. So when you experience staleness in particular, you have no indicators of progression because there is no improvements in performance. The symptoms that can be experienced are decreasing feelings of sport achievement. They feel that they're performing below personal standards, and they have consistent negative self-evaluation. The last I mentioned, which is sport devaluation, what this means is the negative detached attitude towards sport reflected by the lack of concern for sport and performance quality. What the person will experience is a reduced concern for sport and performance quality. They question the value and meaning of sport, and they're really quite resentful towards their sport. So they're not liking the sport anymore. It's really sad when you watch an athlete go through this. It's a fair few theories to help explain burnout in sport. So we'll start with the earlier ones, and we'll go into more of the integrated model of athletic burnout that basically uses all the concepts of the earlier ones. So Smith's cognitive affective model of burnout basically says you go through 4 stages. The first stage, you get confronted with the situational demands, the stress of the situation, the increase in training loads, etc. You'll then appraise the situation. So if you feel that you are not coping, if you feel you can cope in that, then obviously you're going to get training gains. Your body will be able to cope, and you move into that and you get your benefits. If you feel that you can't cope with the increase in training loads and the experience that you're having in your sport, that will lead to physiological responses. So you might even experience something like the body failure to execute. You might experience anxiety related to the fact that you can't see any improvements, etc. And then that leads to the behavioural responses. So whether you stay in your sport or you leave your sport. So it's kind of a cyclic reaction to athletic burnout. And we're looking at how your cognitions, how you evaluate the situation, whether you can or can't cope, and how that will influence the behavioural response. At all stages, your personality and your level of motivation is one of the key features as to how you'll go through that cyclic pattern. Sylvia's negative training stress model, this really looks at training stress and how you see it. So positive adaptation to training stress. So, oh, yep, sweet, this is a challenge. I've got this. I can get through this. You will experience training gains. For those who experience negative adaptation to training stress, you tend to get that lag in training gains because you're still trying to adapt. And that can then lead to training stress syndrome, which generally starts with the staleness where you don't see any improvements. You then overtrain because you can't see any experience, and then you burn out. And unfortunately for some, that would lead to withdrawal in their sport. Coatley's unidimensional identity development and external control model is quite an interesting one, and this looks at the social problems that is a product of the organisation of sport. So they basically say burnout is a social problem, and it's caused by an overly controlling and limiting social structure. So if you have a look at the an athlete's life, it's quite limited in terms of social structure, and majority of their days to do with tasks related to athletic performance, improving strength, etc. Coatley asserts that burnout occurs because the structure of the highly competitive sport doesn't allow youngsters to develop a normal identity because they don't spend much time with their friends outside their sport. So they really only see themselves as athletes. And this becomes a problem because an elite athlete, they're unable to explore and develop other aspects of their identity. So when, say, for example, sport isn't going well, then obviously the athlete is going through a really hard time. They're quite negative about themselves. They're only recognised by others through sport, and their identity becomes hinged upon their sport success. So if they're not successful, then obviously their identity is going to be shot down by those results. Burnout results from stress associated with the creation of that unidimensional identity and that lack of control over one's life. So athletes tend to feel quite, their whole life is dependent on their outcomes in terms of their sport, particularly because they haven't had the opportunity to develop their personality and their outlook of themselves outside their sport, which is really hard when things aren't going well for the athlete, which unfortunately for some will then lead to burnout. Smith and Stein's model looks at sport commitment model, and this also is quite interesting. It looks at burnout is more than just a simple reaction to stress, because not all people will experience burnout. It looks at the determinants of commitment, which are satisfaction. So do the rewards outweigh the cost? How attractive the other alternative options? So how attractive is their sport compared to other options in their lives, as well as resources athletes have invested in. Sometimes we feel that we have to stay in a sport because we've put so much hours and years into a sport. So it has to look at the determinants of commitment. Burnout is likely to occur in an athlete who displays an entrapment profile, where they are participating in sport because they have to, want to. And it's interesting when I talk to athletes and listen to their language, listening to whether they want to or that they have to, then gives me an idea that they might be entrapped in their sport, and their life is all about their sport, because that's way, unfortunately, the process occurs. The self-determination theory, we've looked at this earlier, particularly when we looked at motivation. It has had some use to explain burnout, and it expresses psychological outcomes that are actually influenced by the nature of one's motivation. So motivation that is self-determined in nature is the most adaptive. So if you are in control of that and you do what you want to do, you tend to get more positive outcomes from that. This involves the individual choosing what they want to do rather than being pressured by the internal or external pressures. The risk of burnout is associated with individuals who have less self-determined motivation. So feeling forced to do something rather than you choosing or wanting to take up something can lead to burnout. The self-determination theory further states that motivation is influenced by the three basic psychological needs, which is autonomy, the feelings of personal choice or control, competence, the sense of success, and being effective in one's environment, and relatedness. So looking at the social connections within sport, and feeling of acceptance and belonging. So athletes who do not feel these will be motivated by less self-determined reasons and are more at risk of experiencing burnout. So then it goes back into, is it in the control of the athlete? Are they confident? Are they able to control it? Do they feel connected in that sport? And if they're missing that, then obviously they are doing their sport or motivated to do their sport for things that aren't self-determined, and that puts them at risk of burnout perceptions. The last little model, which is probably the most current one, looks at integrating most of the characteristics. It looks at antecedents, so things that cause burnout, and then it looks at the early signs of burnout. So again, we've got the symptoms, what happens to the thing. When you have an entrapment profile, so you've got that unit, you only see yourself as an athlete and you experience these symptoms, as well as you're more likely to go into experience burnout. So that physical, emotional exhaustion, reduced accomplishments and sport devaluation, both your personality and coping strategies as well as your environment influence your early the early signs, your symptoms, as well as your experience in burnout. And if you experience maladaptive consequences based on all these factors, then one might withdraw from their sport. They might have an impaired immune function. They might experience chronic inflammation, long-term performance impairment as well. So it's kind of just trying to capture all the models that we're explaining, having a look at antecedents, the symptoms of that, how those symptoms and the entrapment profile, as well as someone's personality and coping strategies, as well as environment, influence their burnout, whether they're likely to experience burnout or not, and that then leads to the maladaptive consequences. Treatment and prevention of burnout. One of the most important things you could do as a leader or a coach in sport is make sure you monitor critical states in athletes, know your athletes, know when things are wrong, and tap into it. You need to communicate. You need to set short and long-term goals for competition. In fact, I more focus on the process and performance goals rather than just outcome goals. Make sure they take breaks and that they self-regulate, that they can understand when things are too much, and have some strategies in place to make sure that they are kept at a balanced, so they're kept balanced. Keep a positive outlook, manage post-game emotions, allow them to debrief after a game so that they don't carry it into the next week. And obviously for athletes, if they stay in good physical condition, they're less likely to experience that exhaustion that can come with it, the experiences of burnout. I thought this was quite interesting. I'll probably give this to you in your tutorial. Here's some ideas. So for your essays, you might have a look at this, depending on the perspective, whether you're looking at the self-determination theory or the overtraining, psychosocial sport stress. Have a look at the key variables, what's a key source. So if you're talking about your problems in your essay, have a look at these, and then some strategies that could help help an athlete who's experiencing burnout. Same goes for those athletes who feel entrapped by their sport, and the reason why they're doing it is because the benefits might need to help them recognise the benefits of their sport involvement that may not be evident to them, may be overlooked because they're in that negative space, and then assess what makes sport rewarding to the athlete to incorporate those elements into their sport and experience. Often with the athletes that I'm working with, because they're in a 4-year cycle, they tend to get lost. They tend to start hating their sport, and they tend to be really entrapped into this, I'm only an athlete. And often I have to go back and go, well, why did you start this sport? What did you love about it then? And it's kind of like trying to find the love again. So there's some ideas for you. So please feel free to have a look at that, particularly if you want to talk about burnout in your essay. Last little bit is looking at psychological impact of athletic injuries. It's interesting though, when I do ask in class, and if we were face-to-face, how many of you have experienced an injury? It's interesting that some people haven't. So it's quite a unique experience for those, touch wood, who haven't been injured. But for those who have, obviously you will be quite familiar with the things that come with being physically injured. All right, major contributing factors for athletic injuries. We have the physical. So whether it's overtraining and fatigue, you can get collisions in your sport, which sometimes are in or out of your control, or lack of prep. So you're not physically or mentally ready to play. You have environmental conditions. So we have poor playing conditions. And I often make sure I check venues, particularly going in, or fields are really quite important to check if there's any potholes, or because that can cause serious injuries. So going and checking the field or playing conditions, and equipment failure can be quite disastrous. We also have psychological factors, so the personality of the individual, the stress levels of the individual, and predisposing attitudes. So we'll have a look at them. Can all can contribute to an athlete's injury. And lastly, there are also social factors that can influence. There's this perception of those who play with pain and injuries are valued, and they show toughness. But often when I work with the athletes, I say, well, that's great, and I do get that you want to display this toughness, but you also want to be able to walk at the age of 50. You want to, for some females, bear children. So yes, whilst you might do that moment of I'm a hero, you've got to really look at how it'll affect your future. But also, I kind of question coaches who are insinuating that this is the right thing to do. Okay, the model of stress and athletic injury. So potentially stressful athletic situations. We as athletes will appraise, can I cope, can I not cope? So is it a challenge or is it a threat? And then are the experience of physiological changes as well as the intentional changes that come with that. So as soon as I see something that's really quite threatening, I might become tense. My attention becomes quite narrow and I can be quite distractible. So that's the stress response that we can experience. And this response is actually influenced by our personality, our histories of stresses. Have we seen this before? Have we been injured this way before? As well as your coping resources. And whether you have any psychological skills, strategies that you can put in place to prevent injury. Now, if you don't, and you appraise the situation as threatening, you become tense and your attention gets thrown, you are quite susceptible to gaining an injury. So the three consequences of injuries are narrowing of the visual field, increased distractibility, and as well as increased muscle tension. So these changes enhance the chances of an individual to sustain an athletic injury. So if you experience a perceived imbalance or you think something's threatening, and that exists between perceived personal resources and the demands or the situation that's in front of you, the athlete will experience an increased muscle tension and will have inappropriate narrowing of attention, which unfortunately puts them at risk of injury. Some other important things, I find these interesting because old school ways, this is the way to go. So kind of tap into what you're expecting from athletes or people that you're working with. There are some attitudes that predispose athletes to injuries. So for example, act tough and give 110%. We really need to educate people about what kind of pain to ignore and what kind of pain to listen to. Again, it's amazing what happens to the body when you do get injured, or it's a big game, adrenaline's pumping, you actually might not realize the severity of an injury. I think it's just with young children, particularly if you're working with them, any knocks and it's pull them straight out. You just can't risk it. Another predisposing attitude, if you're injured, you're worthless. Isolating injured athletes from healthy team members. I see this all the time. Athletes then start to feel guilty because they think their coaches suggest, or they might suggest to other players that the athlete is lazy, not mentally tough enough, or not motivated or committed to team success. I think that's really quite harsh and quite a large statement to make, knowing that the coach is not the individual and has no idea of what that person's experiencing. So this can be dangerous as well. And the other one is this sport ethic, and I mentioned it before, that athletes who play with injuries and pain are more valued by coaches and teammates. This really does increase that pressure to play. I mean, some of the Olympians that I'm working with, I know their goal was the Olympics and it was a 4-year process. But to know that they were training with big injuries that can affect them in the future was really quite hard. So it was about trying to make sure they're doing the right management and that they're taking care of themselves, and the sport themselves, the sport itself is taking care of them. We will experience psychological responses to injury and to rehab. So as an individual, you could consider it a disaster. Some will consider it a relief from training and competition. Some will use it to save face from a bad performance. Others will give it's this opportunity to focus on other aspects of their life, or this opportunity to display toughness. So each will be looking at the situation and experience a different psychological response. We also react differently. For some, it's an identity loss. I felt really sorry for mates of mine who thought they were always going to be basketball players, and then got a knee reconstruction and didn't really think about academia or what they wanted to do outside of their sport. They really struggle with that because you lose your identity. You're no longer an athlete. So it's important when working with athletes that you encourage all aspects of their life, not just their sport experience. Some people might be fearful and anxious that they're never going to return. They might also be fearful and anxious that while they're out, somebody might be playing better than them, so there is no place for them to return to. Some might lack confidence, in terms of will they ever return to the level that they were at, or they might just lack confidence, can they still play the same way? They could experience performance drops because they're so worried about the injured body part, or that it could be quite disruptive to group processes, and how is it going to affect the team, particularly if you're the star player and you go out before the finals, how that one injury has affected the whole season. Psychological responses to injury and rehab. I think it's very noted that it is normal for athletes to be stressed, anxious, to be angry, depressed, to have problems with concentration and attention, particularly when pain's in the way. You should note that exercise addiction can happen as well. I remember, this is probably a really bad example, but I was so worried about putting on weight when I've broken many body parts, particularly when I broke my wrist and my thumb. I used to take the cast off and run, so that the cast, because you know how it stinks and it gets itchy. I don't know how I could pop my thumb out of it, but I could actually take my cast off and run. Didn't realise how maladaptive that is until now, looking back, and I still have a really quite large wrist because I didn't let it heal properly. But the athletes will take it to the extreme so that they are ready to come back. And we also have treatment compliance problems. I question how many of you have always stuck to your programs. I know I've been lazy sometimes, particularly when you're younger, because your body can heal better. As you get older, you can understand why it's really important to stick to the compliance of a treatment program. In terms of emotional responses, I used to say that it's like the grief model, the 5-stage grief model. When you lose somebody, that you denials first about the injury, then you're angry about it, then you're trying to bargain, with the doctors, can it be only 6 weeks, etc., etc. Then you experience depression from the actual outcome, and then you accept and reorganize. They kind of said, well, you know what, it's not as similar to the grief model when you experience injuries. In fact, there's only 3 general categories of responses. You first get that injury relevant information processing. Here's injury, here's the severity, here's how long you're out for, etc. Then you experience the emotional upheaval and reactive behaviours. Oh, this is shocking. I'm working with 18-year-olds, 16-year-olds who have just had a reconstruction, which is quite huge. But I'm also looking at them going, you're only young. Your sport career could go to potentially 32. But for that one moment in time, their world's been turned upside down. And I'm like, yeah, but in a year's time, you'll be back in the field or the court. But they can't see that because they're still experiencing that emotional upheaval. And then eventually you go to the positive outlook on coping, and eventually you just got to deal with it and move forward. Probably look out for signs of poor adjustments to injury. Have a look at those athletes who are angry and confused, those who always have that question of when am I returning, when can they return, those who are still in denial of the severity of the injury, those who keep coming back too soon, those who have exaggerated bragging about what they had accomplished before, those who dwell on minor physical complaints, those who feel guilty about letting the team down, Those who withdraw from significant others, sometimes they can go into a real quite depressing episode where they do withdraw and can't communicate and keep to themselves. Rapid mood swings and that statement that they don't think they're ever going to recover. What's really positive about science and medicine these days is they do a great job of getting athletes out really early to return to their sport as soon as they can. So they're deemed physically ready, so that box is ticked. But they sometimes aren't psychologically ready. And this can lead to self-doubts, fears, injuries, and the potential to injure another body part or re-injure that actual part that they have. They could also experience lapses in performance or performance drops that could be temporary or permanent, and they can experience depression. So it's really scary when you watch quick, big athletes, quick operation, boom, out on the field, but their head's not ready, which is really dangerous. So always be mindful and check in to make sure that they don't have any worries or doubts about what's going to happen when they return or when they're on the field. Make sure their head's ready. The recovery process is enhanced if the athlete sees the injury as an opportunity for personal growth and learning. I often talk to the athletes about how much I had become tougher and I grew to know myself, and I got so much out of having that period where I was injured. You learn new strategies, you learn about yourself. It is normal for the athlete to think that the injury is unfortunate, untimely, and inconvenient. Absolutely normal for that. And it is normal to feel irritated, frustrated, and disappointed. So let's not disregard that, but also encourage how much they can get from such an experience. Some of the strategies in rehab that can be quite useful, and it depends if you've got this set up, is allowing the athlete in the recovery process to have the opportunity to express distress and emotions, to allow them to talk and let it out of all the challenges that they're having. Let them share their experience with the athletes who have recovered from a similar injury so that they can see that there is a sign that they will return, or they can return, and share and discuss concerns, fears, and difficulties with a support group. So have injured athletes share together their experiences and their frustrations and the itchiness of the cast and how painful it is and whatever. Let them have that opportunity to talk to each other. But then you also need to counsel them to come up with strategies to help them cope. Some interventions that have been shown to be quite useful, thought stopping and cognitive restructuring. I guess now these days we really look at trying to distract those irrational thoughts. You still will hear them, but then it's about going, okay, well, how rational is that? I'll never return to my sport. Well, so-and-so did, and she had the same injury as me. So trying to have a look at restructuring thoughts are not productive. Imagery is really useful. So whether it's guided imagery to help through relaxation, mastery imagery where you can practice doing your skills inside your head. Healing imagery has had some interesting research results where they've found that by imaging your body part repairing, it actually promotes blood to the area and helps speed up recovery. And you could also go through rehab preparation and coping imagery to talk to the athlete about, well, what's your concerns about rehab, what are you worried about, and then come up with a list of things that could potentially throw them off their rehab or affect their progress, and then come up with strategies to help them through that, how to cope. Relaxation is helpful to reduce stress and speed up the recovery process. The last thing we want the injured athlete to be doing is being quite tense all the time and being irritated. So doing a bit of relaxation. And goal setting is really helpful. Process goals that are focused on rehab. When I work with the athletes, we go to this question, my goals have been affected. And I always talk to them about, no, you've just got different goals for this period in your athletic career. Your goals are now focused on rehab. So they're focused on things like range of motion or being able to walk without crutches. We're going to go through those process goals until your body's 100%. Then we can go and have a look at rethinking about your athletic goals. But for right now in your athletic career, your goal is to get your body 100%. And getting their heads around that so that they are still achieving, because now they've got goals. I've got to, in a week's time, not have to, be off crutches, those kind of goals. So every time they tick a box so they can see progression. So it's a different type of outlook for them. Okay, so they're just the references. I hope you enjoyed this letter. Have a think about, excuse me, whether you want to write this up in your essay. By all means, use what you want from it, and I will see you in your tutorial. See you later. Oh, hang on, I've got to still stop screen sharing. Okay, guys, see ya.